So, who would like to open on questions?
Emmeline from the Irish Georgian Society. In particular, I just want to reiterate the concerns articulated by James Kelly regarding really the tremendously negative impact that the parking of buses have had on our Georgian squares. The Irish Georgian Society, our offices, until 2 months ago, were on Merrion Square South, which has up to 7 or 8 buses at a time parked with the engines on continually. And like this most notably happened with the Merrion Square Open Day, where Dr. Conor Lucy, gave a tour of Merrion Square and its fine architecture, and he actually couldn't be heard over the noise of the buses. And we know similarly here on Parnell Square, a similar situation is occurring on a daily basis on the west side of the square, and it's my understanding also Mountjoy Square is suffering this. And I would just, I suppose, ask the Georgian Society, we've made repeated representation to Dublin Bus and Dublin City Council to find a resolution to the parking. Of course, we're for sustainable transport and believe in public transport, but there has to be a better place to locate these buses. And I suppose I would ask, please, for Dublin City Council to keep this on the top of their agenda and see what can be done to find a resolution with Dublin Bus. Thank you.
Could I ask for a question and rather than a statement?
Ruar McCone is my name, founder of the Mountjoy Square Society. I regret I'm not so quickly asking a question as just to make a point to the audience for those who are interested. James Kelly made a very good point about the proposed development at the top of Parnell Square in relation to the monument, the proposed monument to the victims of clerical abuse. The audience or members of the audience may be interested to know that that is in front of An Bord Pleanála, with the oral hearing opening on the 25th of this month at 10 a.m. That's all. Thank you.
If you talk about taking a cognizance of the past while developing the future, I just was wondering what the principle was for adapting squares, considering we live differently now to when the squares were formed. People don't perambulate. You have the problem with people playing very, lively games of soccer vis-a-vis people with disabilities or other uses for parks, and also the different kinds of trees that are being planted now, because I think that certain trees that were planted in those times are now considered to be too big and too damaging to pavements, and also then the integration of children's play spaces. So I'm wondering, is there a sort of strategy for dealing with squares as public open spaces?
Sorry, can you hear me okay there? I do have a view on this. I mean, you mentioned factors, that have always been with us. Things haven't actually changed. Plus ça change. There have always been issues in relation to disability and access, and perhaps antisocial use, or perhaps games that are. We all heard about how lawn croquet got so nasty that it had to be banned. So, in football it's no different. In relation to things like play spaces, disabled access and the like, they're not really issues. What they are is they're concerns that require a unified strategy. And the problem with Dublin, and it is always the same in Dublin, is that we make these things up on the hoof as we go. I noticed that Todd Longstaff was complaining about the plethora of signs in London. If you want to look at signage, have a good walk around any public space in Dublin, where you'll come across a no parking sign every 5 yards, because the guy who's in charge of laying out the signs isn't quite sure of himself, and he thinks, I better put another one in. So when it comes down to these things, really I think the answer to your point is we need a central, single strategy, a template. Now, you can't make one size fit all, but you can develop sensible strategies. And if you have people who know their job and who understand their job, and who are working in concert with others and cooperating with others, our city architects working with our planners, working with our conservation officers, working with our play officers. And by the way, I don't think we have a play officer at the moment. Then you have a solution to those issues. You can solve almost any problem when people are sensible.
I think trees more of a problem actually is on the pavements, because the roots in a lot of places have got so large that they actually crack the pavements and testify to personal injury. In the question of sports and things, there is, I think there's an area possibly on Mountjoy Square, but the other of the big four actually never seem to have developed areas for sort of like football and things, and certainly they're rigorously banned now. So that doesn't seem to be such a, I wouldn't have thought such an issue. I would say there's one thing I do get, the human side here now of the usage of particularly the larger central squares where it actually alters with the daylight. And there's this lovely sound if you're out as light is falling of the hand-rung bell as the people go around to alert people to leave and they lock up. So I think there's still a sense of interaction and living spaces that they haven't become sort of cold or impersonal.
And it involves how you use the Georgian houses in the Northern Square. Just to point out that Parnell Square is a very sacred place. The prisoners that night after they surrendered in 1916 were brought to where about the Garden of Remembrance is and corralled in there. So it has historic interest. However, it's how do you, that whole area, once upon a time, when you look at Tom's directory, it contained 36 substantial hotels, you know, and then going down to O'Connell Street where there was the Hammam and all these hotels. Now, I think what everybody has to direct themselves to is to how do we, now Hotel City is growing up there again, you have Jury's, Castle, Cassidy's, you know, there are 12 of them there now, hard to believe. But how do you encourage that? Because you have to find uses for the buildings. So the big question is, how do you encourage it? Now, I'm going to answer the question a little bit. Because these are important people who are with here. I realise in this room that I'm with the people who can actually change the city and balance it. And they have a very important job. And I wrote 15 years ago to the Department of Finance, where I once worked, and got a PFO letter back from a nice guy I worked with, Jim McCaffrey. And what I had wanted was tax relief for the development of antique or historic hotels and properties. Proper now, not the Section 19 thing, because that's still no good to you. You know, you get that in business anyway. I just wanted double relief. So I'm here with important people in this room. I run 10 hotels in total, all of them in historic buildings. And I'd like to think that somebody would look at this square and realise how urgent Parnell Square, Gardiner Road, Denmark Street, North Great Georgia Street, and Mountjoy Square, how you have the tourist industry, you have the story, but how do you do it? So there you are. Now that's my question to these important people.
Yeah, I think I'll answer that one myself, actually, if you guys don't mind. What you're suggesting sounds rather like destroying the village to save it. The reason that hotels, or that small hotels, moved out, the plethora of small hotels that we used to have in these areas, in Georgian houses, moved out, was a very, very simple one. In old hotels, people shared bathrooms. You had common bathrooms on corridors. You had subdivided rooms. People were willing to put up with a lower standard. They were willing to put up with rooms that were taller than they were wide. Now, that isn't going to happen in the context of the Georgian house. The houses that we're talking about in particular in Parnell Square are probably more important than almost any other class or design of Georgian house in Dublin, bar the ones in Henrietta Street. Of all the houses that should not be touched or altered, they are at the top of my list. If we had a grade 1, grade 2, grade 3 listing process, they would be grade 1, 4-star. So I don't think that is an answer. I do think that you put your finger on the nub of the problem, which is tourism. And tourists will come to an area where heritage has been preserved. And it's a well-known fact. Fáilte Ireland and the Heritage Council are trotting this out again and again and again, and nobody listens. That for every dollar, for every quid, for every euro that is invested in heritage, you get 4 back from a tourist point of view. Again, the square itself, the actual surface of the square, the open area, the idea of having the pleasure gardens back in, that itself would have an international cultural significance. Now, I think hotels have a place, and I think boutique hotels in particular have a place, but I think we need to be very, very careful that we don't actually end up destroying these houses. For example, the new Maldron Hotel, built only around the corner in Granby Row, actually resulted inadvertently, it must be admitted, in the destruction of the old Bethesda Chapel, which was buried and concealed within the walls. So I have some concern and some reluctance to kind of put things into the hands of the hotel trade in terms of tax relief. Look at Gardiner Street, an awful lot of hotels there, and they've done very, very little for the heritage of the area.
Okay. So, Liz?
I just have a question for Christopher and James, probably. It was interesting about St Andrew's Square. I hope I got it right, which is had similarity layout to Mountjoy Square, and yet the development. One is for you, Christopher. How did they come up with the new scheme? In other words, was there a lot of architectural conservation, archaeology, and all that done? And how did it get to the situation? Because one of my key things really is that you can't divorce the buildings. If the buildings are important to preserve, well then so is the entity, which is the square, the garden, and the buildings. But I'm just wondering about that. And the second thing really for James is, how far do you go to restoring the gardens? And it has to have modern consultation and uses, but it's also about the historic character of the place and keeping that as well.
With the St Andrew's Square in Edinburgh, which had become run down, everybody accepted that the state of it wasn't really suitable. And I think there was consultation, if you like, about the new designs with Gillespie's designs there, which have been, I think, reasonably well accepted. But really the one was left with very little else there apart from the planting, a lot of which still survives in the sort of periphery of the square. But the layout, the cross paths and so on are entirely new.
Was there any archaeology done to discover whether the old paths were still there?
I don't know, to be honest. We do have reasonable cartographic records of the layout of the square, certainly, but I'm not sure that the current design actually took a great cognizance of the earlier designs.
And just to deal with the second half of your question, I think in a way Merlo Kelly has actually answered that question in her lecture, because one of the points that she was kind of coming up with very quietly and in a far more subtle way than I would, was that when you mess around with the topography, the layout of the urban architecture of a city, you need to be very, very sure that you're doing the right thing, otherwise you're going to wreck it. Now, to come back to your question in relation to, say, for example, Parnell Square, and in a way it's the same question that has been answered here by Chris. The problem as I see it in Glasgow was the same one that we may well have here if we try and do something, which is a bad brief, no real thought as to what result you wanted. It's a mistake, I think, going into an architectural competition unless you know what the winner's going to be. Architectural competitions have a habit of throwing up schemes that actually aren't very responsive and that are often brought in by outsiders. I actually think that a well-considered brief is the answer to these things, and I think that you need to have a system of appointment whereby an architect is appointed, or an architectural department such as, say, the OPW handles the project, and where they are prepared to revise, change, alter and ameliorate a scheme where it doesn't work, because then the consultation process and the design process run hand in hand. With architectural competitions, you don't get that. Now, the other part of that I was going to say was in relation to the validity of going in for a full restoration, for example, or a near full restoration of the new gardens in Parnell Square. If I can make an analogy, and it's one that Adrian might understand, if you have a piece of antique furniture, a piece of antique sculpture, or a piece of art, and 85% approximately of that piece is intact, then generally that's the rule of thumb by which you say, yeah, we'll put the money in, we'll buy the table, we'll buy the picture, we'll spend the money on restoration and conservation and make up the difference of the 15% that's missing. Now, in a way, when you look at Parnell Square, when you look at Rutland Square, whatever you want to call it, we look at the square and we think it's all gone. We don't see, because we don't gain admittance to it a lot of the time, the fact that the terraces are there, all of the obelisks, and as I said, the landscape features are there. But more importantly, what we're looking at is we're only looking at a fragment of the picture. The hospital is there, the assembly rooms are there, the rotunda is there, all of the bits, the pieces, and all the kit of parts that made it up are there. Palace Row is there. The large part of the east side of the square is there, and nearly all of the west side. Now, in that context, I would describe that particular piece of furniture or piece of art, as it may be, as being more than 85% complete. And on that basis, I would argue for full restoration.